All those opposed to what the honourable member is proposing will please say nay.
D'accord. La Chambre.
Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion?
Adopté.
Carried.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
And good news about that, with the boundary change, they've removed "and" or "a" from my electoral district name, so we'll save a couple characters for future reference. It's a pleasure to rise today to present the supplementary opinion from the official opposition for this important report from the Standing Committee. The comments of the chair are, of course, thanking our analysts, clerk, witnesses, everyone who participated are incredibly important. This is a very important report about a very important subject, and of course, the Conservatives did have some recommendations that we did not concur with. This is why we've added a supplemental to the report. There is important context included in this, and of course, the official opposition does want it to be noted that an audit of the Trudeau Foundation is an important component that should be considered by the government and should be undertaken. And of course, the official opposition does reject the 16th recommendation included in the report. Thank you very much, Chair.
Dépôt de projet de loi émanant des députés.
Introduction of private members' bills.
L'honorable. Okay. Je vais le répéter.
I will repeat. Private members' bills.
Première lecture de projet.
First reading of Senate public bills.
Motion.
Motions.
Présentation de pétitions.
Presenting petitions.
Député de.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise virtually this morning and resisting any attempt or inclination to deny UC a few moments ago. I move on to petitions, where I'm pleased to present petition of great concern to residents of Saanich Gulf Islands. It's extraordinary to people throughout this region who have a deep concern for the fate of our wild Pacific salmon. That the report, and this is the subject of the petition, the report of Mr. Justice Cohen on the fate of the salmon that came out during the time in which it was commissioned when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. It's been in front of us now for close to a decade. And the petitioners...
I'm sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Je pense à un appel au règlement.
I believe there's a point of order. The honourable member for Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, the lack of interpretation is preventing us from participating in the debate.
Hope that the translation will happen. Donc c'est là maintenant. Okay, I'll allow the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands to restart her petition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Briefly, the petition deals with the ongoing crisis for the wild Pacific salmon. Petitioners note that the report of Mr. Justice Cohen has been in front of the government now for many years. There has been, as the petitioners note, a commitment to get the toxic salmon factories known as salmon aquaculture operations. There has been, as the petitioners note, areas of Vancouver Island, particularly near the Discovery Channel, was Prime Minister. It's been water
petitions
to remove the
honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Stock with Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise virtually this morning. Viruses from resisting any attempt or so-called farms. The petitioner's crisis for the wild Pacific salmon to enact all the recommendations of the report of Mr. Justice Cohen and to do so without further delay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition, the honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe. Red Deer Lacombe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hope that you'll grant me some grace given the gravity of the petition I'm presenting today. It's a petition arising on events that happened on September 16th, 2021, when the horrific and preventable murders of Mikhail Erica Bush, age 24, and her baby son, Noah Lee McConnell, age 16 months, in their apartment building in Hinton, Alberta, were perpetrated by a known registered sex offender, and the family had no idea that this individual was living there. And short 10 days after they moved in, the offense happened. And this petition has been signed by almost 22,000 Canadians. And what they've asked for is we, the undersigned citizens and residents of Canada, call upon the Government of Canada to require mandatory reporting by convicted sexual offenders to the nearest police station upon any change of residence, clarify that failure to report as required is an offence for which an arrest warrant shall be issued, and create a specifically designated offender classification for persons convicted of sexual assault offences against children, where the sentence of more than 2 years is imposed, or for offenders convicted of 2 or more violent sexual offences or offences involving the abduction of women and or children. We have a responsibility to this family and to all of the victims of sexual violence in this country, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the government responding to this petition.
Presenting a petition, présentation de pétition, the honourable member for Nickel Belt.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to submit a petition on behalf, in both official languages, on behalf of the residents of Nickel Belt and Greater Sudbury Region. I am tabling a petition calling on the federal government to move forward immediately with the bold emission caps for the oil and gas sector that are comprehensive in scope and realistic in achieving an interim and science-based target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. La pétition indique le groupe.
The petition indicates that the climate panel has warned us repeatedly that the temperature over the next 20 years, if it's not kept down, will lead to extreme weather conditions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition, presenting a petitions, the honourable member for Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa.
Speaker, I rise for the 17th time on behalf of the people of Swan River, Manitoba, to present a petition. The people of Swan River have had enough of this liberal, soft-on-crime policies that allow criminals to run rampant over the community without fear of jail. Members of this small community don't recognize their once safe town. Businesses are now forced to use a community group chat to alert each other about armed robberies so the next business down the street can be prepared. The petitioners are calling for action before it's too late. Mr. Speaker, the people of Swan River demand that this Liberal government repeal their soft-on-crime policies that directly threaten their livelihoods and their community. I support the good people of Swan River.
Presenting a petition, présentation de pétition, the honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition signed on by Canadians calling on the government to use all tools at its disposal, including invoking the notwithstanding clause, to override the Supreme Court's unjust Bissonnette decision that struck down a law passed by the previous Conservative government that gave judges the discretion to apply consecutive parole ineligibility periods to persons convicted of multiple murders to take into account each victim. The consequence of this decision has been to significantly reduce the sentences of some of Canada's worst killers, and it's been more than a year, and this government has sat on its hands and done nothing. Petitioners are calling on the government to take action.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition, the honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I actually have 3 petitions to present, and I'll do those as quickly as possible. The first one is similar to one that a colleague of mine just introduced, and that has to do with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent warning. The petitioners are specifically calling on the Government of Canada to move forward immediately with bold emissions caps for the oil and gas sector that are comprehensive in scope and realistic in achieving the necessary targets that Canada has set to reduce emissions by 2030. The second one, Mr. Speaker, has to do with the subject of transportation, and this is specifically on the comes from primarily the Model Aeronautics Association of Canada. I know a number of petitions like this have been presented in the past, and this one calls on the Government of Canada and specifically the Minister of Transportation to review the decision of Transport Canada to cancel the MAAC members exemption of Part 9 of the Canadian Aviation Act, and to reinstate the exemption to MAAC members or remove fixed-wing RC models from the category of remote piloted aircraft systems as listed in the CAA. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I have a petition that has 210 signatures on it from Canadians that are calling to the government's attention
a request that they have to see the way that child support is determined in Canada. The petitioners are calling on the Government of Canada to consider using household income instead of personal income in all cases. Not only in undue hardship instances as the standard for calculation of receiving child support in cases of joint and/or shared custody, and thus allowing for a common standard throughout departments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition, the honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to table this petition on behalf of residents from Hornby Island, Denman Island, and from Deep Bay on Vancouver Island. And they call on the government to suspend or postpone, not suspend, postpone licensing for their shellfish aquaculture facilities located near herring spawning and rearing habitat in Bayne Sound until a full ecosystem-based assessment is completed on the impacts of this industry's activities on the herring stock, and that they also establish a record of effectively managing their gear and equipment and pay for the cleanup of tons of plastic debris, and further develop with First Nations a co-management plan for Bayne Sound and Lambert Channel that is area-based and ecosystem-based and recognizes their unceded traditional territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting the petitions, the honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an honour to rise today and present four more petitions on behalf of the members of the residents of the North Okanagan, Shuswap, and Canada who are concerned about this NDP Liberal government's overreach into their lives. These petitions call on the Minister of Health to work with the natural health products industry to adjust Health Canada's cost recovery rates and to accurately reflect the size and scope of the industry. Only implement changes once the self-care framework is adjusted. We heard about this many times from residents over the summer, and I'm very happy to present four more in a series of petitions that have been coming to me from residents who are overly concerned about this overreach of this government. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the honourable member for Medicine Hat, Carson Warner. I go to Kevin.
I have the honour of presenting a petition for Canadians who are wishing to draw attention to the Attorney General and Minister of Justice for Canada in regards to the Bissonnette decision by the Supreme Court. The result of that decision, Mr. Speaker, some of Canada's most heinous mass murderers will have the parole ineligibility. The Attorney General and Minister of Justice to invoke the notwithstanding clause with respect to the Bissonnette decision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition.
The important role that Ottawa plays working with the provinces to ensure whether it's credentials being recognized, the shortage of healthcare workers, and so forth. It's a pleasure for me to table the petition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I, too, along with many of my Conservative colleagues, rise today to present a petition related to the legal system in this country. And specifically, these petitioners draw to the attention of the Minister of Justice the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in R v. Bissonnette that struck down Section 745.51 of the Criminal Code, which allowed parole ineligibility periods to be applied consecutively for mass murderers. As a result of this decision, Mr. Speaker, many of Canada's most heinous killers are being let out of prison far before they should. Therefore, the undersigned petitioners from across Canada urge the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada to invoke the notwithstanding clause and override this decision to ensure that justice is actually served within our justice system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition. The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners that signed this petition this morning are concerned about the ease of access to online sexually explicit material, including violent and degrading material. They're concerned that this is a public health crisis and a public safety concern. The petitioners note that the significant portion of commercially accessible sexual material has no age verification software in place. Petitioners note that many serious harms associated with access to this type of material include favorable attitudes towards sexual violence and the harassment of women. As such, the petitioners are calling on the quick passage of Bill S-210, the Protection of Young Persons from Exposure to Pornography Act. The second petition I have, Mr. Speaker, today comes from Canadians from across the country who are concerned about the Liberal government's decisions to put themselves in place of parents and provinces. They support the Leader of the Opposition's comments when he said that the Prime Minister should butt out of these kinds of decisions. They want to support Premier Blaine Higgs and his policy 713. They note that in the vast majority of cases, parents care about the well-being of their children and love them much more than any state-run institution. The role of the government is to support families, respect parents, and not dictate how they should make decisions for their children. Therefore, they call on the Government of Canada to butt out and let Canadians raise their own children. The next petition I have, Mr. Speaker, comes from Canadians from across the country who are concerned about the Liberals' interference in charitable status. They note that in the Liberal platform that there was a values test that they were placing on this, and they were noting that this could jeopardize the charitable status of hospitals, house of worships, schools, homeless shelters, and other organizations. They also note that the Liberals previously used a test to discriminate against groups that were applying for the Canada Summer Jobs grant.
Unbelievable.
The petitioners are asking the House of Commons to protect and preserve the application of charitable status rules on a politically and ideologically neutral basis without discrimination on the basis of political or religious values, without the imposition of another values test. They also ask for affirmation of their freedom of expression as Canadians. The next petition I have is signed by Canadians from across the country who are concerned that women's shelters are seeing increased demand and that the high cost of living and the housing crisis have made it harder for women and children fleeing violence to find a place to live. At this time, they note that the Liberal government has dramatically increased spending on bureaucracy and consultations, but are cutting $145 million of funding for women's shelters. They therefore call on the Government of Canada to restore the funding for these women's shelters. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the last petition I have to present is from Canadians from across the country who are concerned about the increased risks of violence that happens to women that are pregnant. Currently, the injury or death of preborn children as victims of crime are not considered aggravating circumstances for sentencing. They call on the Government of Canada to recognize this, to legislate the abuse against the abuse of a pregnant woman and the inflicting of harm on a preborn child as aggravating circumstances for sentencing in the criminal code. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Et voila. Questions on the order paper? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask that all questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
Okay, and also while you are on your feet, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do rise, and with respect to on Thursday, October the 19th, 2023, the Speaker raised two items for private members' business that appeared to infringe on the Crown's financial imperative and ask members to bring forward interventions on these matters. Without commenting on the subject matter of the two bills in question, I submit that the bill C-353, sponsored by the member from Thornhill, and Bill 356, sponsored by the member from Carleton, both infringe on the Crown's financial prerogative, and both bills require a royal recommendation. Clause 21 of Bill C-353, relating to the programs to encourage cooperation, provides that the Minister may, in cooperation with the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, establish and implement programs designed to encourage individuals to cooperate with the Government of Canada to secure the release of Canadian nationals and eligible protected persons who are held hostage or arbitrarily detained in state-to-state relations outside Canada. Clause 21, bracket 2 of Bill 353 further provides that the Minister may pay a monetary award to the individual who provides that information in an amount and manner defined by the Minister. I submit respectfully that there is no authority in statute or in an appropriation to establish such a program set out in Clause 21, nor the authority to make payments subject to the provisions set out in Clause 21, bracket 2. Therefore, Clause 21 in toto seeks to impose a new and distinct draw on the Consolidated Revenue Fund in a manner that is not currently authorized. Turning to Bill C-356, I submit that the repurposing of $100 million from the Housing Accelerator Fund and the provision to give effect to 100% GST rebate on the new residential rental property for which the average rent payable in below market rate both seek to infringe on the Crown's financial prerogative. The Housing Accelerator Fund was established as a program administered by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and is funded by a voted appropriation by Parliament through the estimates process. The member is seeking to change the terms and conditions and purposes of the Housing Accelerator Fund in a manner that is inconsistent with the program's parameters as established and therefore deviates from the authority granted by Parliament. The tabling of the main estimates and the supplementary estimates is preceded by the recommendation of Her Excellency the Governor-General for voted appropriations. That royal recommendation sets the maximum amount, the purpose and terms and conditions of the voted appropriations contained in the estimates, documents, and voted upon by Parliament. Secondly, the provisions to provide 100% GST rebate on new residential rental property would be a rebate paid out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for which a builder, landlord, or buyer can claim the said rebate. I would point out to Bill C-56, which also proposes 100% rebate, GST rebate that is, for purpose-built rental housing, which, while different in design, was accompanied by a royal recommendation. Since, when brought into force, would create a new and distinct draw on the Consolidated Revenue Fund. It stands to reason that the program for which the terms, purposes, and conditions of the GST rebate envisioned in C-356 cannot rely on the royal recommendation provided with Bill C-56. C-356 must similarly require a new royal recommendation to authorize a new and distinct draw on the Consolidated Revenue Fund. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the honourable member for his input. Of course, looking at that closely. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day. Government orders, government bills, commons. Resuming consideration at second reading of Bill C-57, Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement Implementation Act 2023.
When we left that yesterday, we had 4 minutes left on questions and comments from the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot. So questions and comments. The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his speech on the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. As you know, free trade is very close and dear to my heart. I wanted to ask him about his own Ukrainian community, the diaspora that has gathered within his community, and why they would feel that this agreement is really important to Canada. So I would welcome his thoughts on that.
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question posed by my colleague from Abbotsford. And just to note the work that he did in making sure that under the previous Conservative government, seeing, I believe it was 43 trade agreements with different countries from 47. My apologies, 47. In fact, that member probably has forgotten more about trade than most Liberals will ever know. But Mr. Speaker, he asks an important question when it comes to the Ukrainian diaspora within my community, and as is the case of many rural prairie MPs. There are significant Ukrainian roots that exist. In fact, the Ukrainian Cultural Village, a great place to visit for families, is located just north of my constituency. And it speaks to that richness, especially when it comes to those roots in agriculture that exist. And to make sure that we are taking seriously the fact that we established, I believe it was in 2013, the first Ukrainian Free Trade Agreement, and that now we have the opportunity to build on that. But Mr. Speaker, to emphasize that we have to get it right. It's before this House. We need to make sure that it goes through the process to ensure that every section, every subsection of this bill is done right for the Ukrainian diaspora in our country, for all Canadians, and for a country that is facing just incredible circumstances, has shown themselves to stand strong against this unjustified and illegal Russian invasion. For both sides, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we get it right, and that's why I hope all members of this place take seriously the responsibility that is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that that in fact happens.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Flamborough-Glenbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to ask my colleague, liquefied natural gas is a great opportunity for Canada. There's been 18 products on the desk of the Prime Minister waiting approval. And, you know, if we look at the situation currently in Ukraine, you know, reducing reliance on Russian natural gas obviously is something where we could help. Canada has this great opportunity. Maybe you can expand a bit on that in the context of the free trade agreement.
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate this being asked from an Ontario MP. And just to emphasize to all the Albertans watching how the question around energy security is not something that is unique to the West, not something that is unique to Alberta, but something that truly is a national issue. And Mr. Speaker, to directly answer my colleague from Ontario's question, it is an international issue as well. Canada has the opportunity to ensure that we displace Russian crude and gas, that dictator and despot crude oil and natural gas, and specifically when it comes to LNG, we have the ability to not only make sure that dollars are not going to dictators like the tyrant Vladimir Putin that is engaged in this illegal invasion in the sovereign country of Ukraine. We can make sure that the very people that he is forcing to fight against that aggression are forced to purchase natural gas that funds that very war machine. Mr. Speaker, Canada is the solution to ensure that we have energy security for our allies and friends around the world. And Mr. Speaker, when that happens, our world becomes a safer place. Now, the regrettable reality is, after 8 years of that Liberal Prime Minister, we have seen the world less safe because they refuse to allow Canadian energy and the expertise that comes along with it to make our world a safer place. So, Mr. Speaker, let's get that done.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for Richmond Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a great pleasure for me to rise in the House today to talk about the support of this important legislation and to implement the modernized Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. As we all know, since the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine territories, Canada has demonstrated unwavering support of Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. Today, we have another opportunity to demonstrate support to the Ukraine with the implementation of the modernized CUFTA, which is, of course, the reason why we're all here today. Mr. Speaker, when I met with the people from the Ukrainian community in Richmond Centre, they shared with me their support for our government's vision of a democratically strong nation that values the importance of international collaboration, the rule of law, global peace, and security. I also want to take a moment to convey my appreciation to Ukraine community organizations like the Ukrainian Community Society of Ivan Franko in Richmond Centre for all they do in supporting the Ukrainian community here in Canada and promoting Ukrainian arts and culture. Mr. Speaker, Canada and Ukraine share these values, and most importantly, the people-to-people tie. On December 2nd, 1991, Canada became the first Western nation to recognize Ukraine's independence. And today, Canada stands with Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. When our allies need support, the Government of Canada has the responsibility to support them. I appreciate and thankful for the Government of Canada's support of Ukraine since the war began. Canada has provided over $8 billion toward financial, military, humanitarian, development, and immigration assistance for Ukraine. And recently, the Government of Canada announced a new investment of $650 million over 3 years to supply Ukraine with 50 armored vehicles, including armored medical evacuation vehicles built by Canadian workers in London, Ontario. Russian illegal invasion affects global inflation. It affects us. Increase in food prices and the supply chain effect. Global peace and security are an essential piece and part of our global economic prosperity. By modernizing the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, we can provide additional assistance that Ukraine needs. With its reconstruction effort, the cost of which the World Bank has estimated will be 411 billion US dollar, of course. And these efforts will involve sectors such as infrastructure, renewable resources, and financial services, which are all areas where Canada has strengths. Already, Canadian firms have indicated an interest in launching and expanding their operation in Ukraine, including with respect to reconstruction, and we have today a tool to support their involvement. I'm referring to the newly added investment chapter, previously missing from the 2017 CUFTA. As you may have aware, Canada and Ukraine have an existing foreign investment promotion and protection agreement signed in 1994. However, this new modernized investment chapter not only brings this new agreement in line with Canada's model comprehensive FTAs, but also updates our investment protections to address modern investment issues and concerns. Mr. Speakers and honorable members, please allow me to briefly present this new investment chapter that results from our effort in negotiating the modernized CUFTA and which will support Canadian firms to participate in Ukraine reconstruction's efforts. The CUFTA investment chapter modernized the framework of protections for investors and their investment with a comprehensive set of obligations in line with Canada's most ambitious trade agreements. I'm also proud to announce that this investment chapter is the first negotiated using Canada's most recent model that seeks to better ensure Investment Obligation Act as intended and provide the necessary policy flexibility for government to act in the public interest. As such, this new drafting for the investment chapter will allow Canada and Ukraine to maintain their right to regulate in key areas such as environment, health, safety, Indigenous rights, gender equality, and cultural diversity. Additionally, this new chapter also includes a modern dispute settlement mechanism that offers strengthened alternatives to avoid arbitration as well as enhanced transparency of proceedings commitments. In all, these outcomes represent a significant improvement over 1994 FIPA with Ukraine, which this chapter will replace, and will strengthen the environment within which Canadian investors can invest with more confidence in Ukraine reconstruction. Mr. Speaker, honorable members, I thank you for this opportunity to describe what we can achieve on investment through the modernization of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. I hope I have made clear why this modern and comprehensive free trade agreement will be instrumental not only in bringing our long-term commercial relations with Ukraine, but also in support its forthcoming reconstruction efforts. To end this, I urge all honorable members to support Bill C-57 and allow us to collectively move forward and implement the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement on a timely basis. And once again, Canada will always stand with Ukraine and its people as long as it takes. Slava Ukraini. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question kommentaar. The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his excellent speech on the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. One of the major challenges facing Ukraine is energy security. Ukraine formerly depended on Russia for its natural gas supplies, and of course that opportunity has quickly evaporated. Canada stands in a perfect position to sell natural gas to Ukraine. Unfortunately, our current government has been very reluctant to promote the sale of liquefied natural gas to the rest of the world, claiming that there's no business case to be made for it. However, now we have an opportunity within the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement to perhaps find a way of getting our natural gas to Ukraine, providing them with energy security. I would ask this member, what components of this agreement, if any, actually will expedite and assist Canadian companies to actually export natural gas, liquefied natural gas, to Ukraine?
Member for Richmond Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you to the honourable members from Abbotsford for your questions. And I agree. Prior to this free trade agreement, we would never expect Ukraine be illegally invaded by Russia. And the importance of energy is something that we all should be concerned of, especially when we have these resources here available in Canada. And it's important for us to continue the support to Ukraine, especially with the reconstruction. And hopefully we can see the war end soon, because as people are suffering on the ground, it's important for us as government to look into potential resources to assist the effort of fueling the energy need in Ukraine. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
The honourable member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a very simple question. Often, with international agreements, Quebec and other provinces are barely consulted, if they're even consulted at all. So here's my question for my colleague. Does he know whether the current agreement will have an impact on the constitutional rights or jurisdiction of provinces and of Quebec? And if the answer is yes, were provinces and Quebec consulted about these provisions? The honourable member for Richmond Centre.
Well, thank you, honourable members, for the questions. And I encourage, as we move forward with the second reading, and as this bill will be discussed in the trade committees, I encourage the member to suggest if there are any witnesses that should be testified during the standing committee. And it's important for us to understand that this free trade agreement is not specific to any provinces or territories, but a nation as a whole. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Cowichan, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his remarks today. This legislation was tabled in the House last week, I believe, on October the 17th. And I'm just hoping, Mr. Speaker, that the member can enlighten me, because, the government's own policy requires that before the tabling of legislation, it requires that 21 sitting days expire so that members of Parliament can take a look at the agreement before any enabling legislation is brought in. We have not had that presented to members of Parliament. We also don't have an economic statement. The government's attached a lot of importance to Bill C-56, so I'm just wondering, Mr. Speaker, through you, why did the government not take time to do those two key priorities? We have plenty of time to consider this legislation, and instead maybe devote the House's time to Bill C-56, which the government likes to complain so often that it's not moving ahead. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond Centre.
Thank you for that question. And I believe this agreement was signed in September. And of course, this is the time we also take the opportunity to hear from all sides to see the potential of this free trade agreement. And if there are any rooms to improve on, it'll be great that we can bring this forward to the standing committee and be discussed in that. Thank you.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
L'honorable député de Berthier-Masquinongé.
The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am very happy to speak to Bill C-57. Right off the bat, I'd like to say that we support free trade in general, and we also support this free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine. As you know, we have stood with Ukrainians since the beginning of the conflict, and this free trade agreement follows suit. So it's another step in our support. Now, the 2017 version of the agreement was vague, a lot less clear than this version. So we find that this version is positive in that regard, especially when it comes to implementation mechanisms, which were modified to be, in fact, enhanced and better. This bill sends a very clear message to the whole world, and especially to Ukrainians, a message about the friendship that unites us with Ukraine, especially in the context of the particular situation that is ongoing. One positive element of this bill is that it identifies the Ukrainian territory as including the Donbass and Crimea. That may seem symbolic, but it's important. It's meaningful to take that kind of action so that the international community's stance is clear. And in the upcoming weeks, I will attend the Asia-Pacific Cooperation Forum, and I will carry the same message on behalf of all members of this House, Mr. Speaker. This agreement was signed with the President of Ukraine during his last visit to Canada, and it will be positive, but the issue is that bills that we pass at Parliament will allow for the creation of institutions and mechanisms which will oversee free trade agreements. But we never have the occasion to give our opinions about the content of these free trade agreements unless, Mr. Speaker, unless we vote yay or nay to the bill as a whole. As parliamentarians, though, our job is to analyze various legislation, to give our opinions about it so that we can end up with better, more refined legislation of which the details have been fulsomely studied. But unfortunately, we can only vote yes or no to the bill as a whole. My colleague, with whom I'll be sharing my time, the member for Beauport-Limoilou, she kindly agreed to let me speak before her. Thank you for reminding me about that, Mr. Speaker. Where was I? Right. The powers and authorities of Parliament. Well, they're incredibly limited. We can never really speak. I remember when I was first elected in 2019, shortly after that, the House was asked to ratify the Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, which created further concessions to supply management. And it caused me pain and unhappiness that I had to vote in favor of that agreement, all while knowing that it would cause harm to some of our people, of our constituents. So let's sit together, all parties together, and see how we can improve the process through which we adopt international trade agreements. That would be very useful and important, Mr. Speaker. Many people here were in favor of Bill 282. But currently, the way we arrive at free trade agreements mean that we have to be rather creative and find ways to protect supply management through other legislation. But in the future, there will be sensitive issues where some groups will be more affected than others. And we need to protect all groups equally. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we need to really take a close look at the current system for adopting free trade agreements. In signing free trade agreements, provinces and Quebec are called upon to apply the clauses and provisions which are under their jurisdiction and implement them. Some here wonder why Quebec wants independence, why we want independence for Quebec. Well, this is just yet another relevant example of why we want independence. We want to have control over what goes into our international agreements. That's just one example, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of International Trade gave me a very clear answer to my question. You will remember that the agreement with Ukraine will replace the 2017 version, but there was an order, a unilateral government order, saying that all Ukrainian products would not be charged tariffs upon entry to Canada. That was helpful for the Ukrainian economy, and no one was against that. But the government was in such a hurry and in such a panic, so they included supply-managed products, and that is unacceptable. Now, of course, we have to help. We have always wanted to help. The Bloc has always voted in favor of all measures to support Ukraine in this horrible ongoing conflict. But why, in that government order, were supply-managed products included? Mr. Speaker, supply-managed sectors tried to lobby the government, and we also lobbied the government, and the government was receptive and removed supply-managed products from that government order. So we're not sure about what the future will hold for us and whether there might be future concessions in supply management. Now, as for the rest of the bill, Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, a lot of this bill deals with structures and implementation mechanisms. But I'd like to talk about the bill through another angle or perspective. Now, in the section, Mechanisms, Investors, and States, multinational corporations are given a level playing field with states. And that's really serious, Mr. Speaker, because states need to have the right to legislate and to regulate to ensure the common good of citizens. But with this version as is, multinationals would have too much power. So we need to find a way to stop that because it doesn't make any sense at all, Mr. Speaker. And there's a lot in this bill, in fact, that is illogical. I'd like to mention perhaps one last weakness when it comes to ethical practices and environmental protection practices. This bill seems to be a whole host of good intentions of encouraging people to use exemplary practices, but then there's nothing really binding. Now, I have about a minute and a half left, so I'd like to conclude by saying that this free trade agreement is important. We're partners with Ukraine, and we will remain partners with them. But I hope that this horrible war will end soon. Quebec has excellent businesses and a lot of experts, and we will be able to help, I hope, in rebuilding Ukraine. I would like us to help our people, too, once in a while. Last week, we voted on a bill to increase pensions for seniors ages 65 and up. Members of the FADOC will be visiting the Hill today, and I call on all parliamentarians to respect them. They're important. They help seniors, especially seniors ages 65 to 74, who have been totally ignored because the government has created unfair age-based discrimination. And, Mr. Speaker, that's serious. This has been going on for months. I don't understand how it hasn't been fixed. Let's fix it ASAP. And now I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Questions and comments?
Les honorables députés qui sont ici en chambre.
I'd like to remind members here that the debate is taking place. We'd like everyone to take their places, if possible.
Another person's chair and not lean up against the desks. L'honorable Secretary.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
And I appreciate the fact that the Bloc is supporting the bill. This trade agreement, from an economic point of view, is an agreement that will benefit both Canada and Ukraine. But that's not the aspect that I want to pick up on. The member spoke a great deal about the special, wonderful relationship between Canada and Ukraine. And we have an opportunity here by the passage of this legislation to make a very powerful statement, a statement that goes far beyond just the economics. It can deal with everything from the illegal invasion of the Putin war to a morale boosting on the front lines in Ukraine of Ukrainian freedom fighters. The question I have for the member is, would he not agree with me that it would be a wonderful thing to ultimately see this bill pass through all aspects, including the Senate, before the end of this year?
The honourable member for Berthier-Mascouche. Look, this doesn't happen all that often, but once again, I agree with the member for Winnipeg North, and it's really delightful whenever that happens. I'm a guy, Mr. Speaker, I'm an ordinary guy, down to earth, and I've been here for 4 years, and I find that things move so slowly. Whenever anyone asks, can we move ahead on this, I say, yeah, let's do it, like intelligently, but let's do it. The honourable member for Churchill.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his speech. I'm from a region, and I represent a region that was very negatively affected by a free trade deal. As a result of that deal, we lost some well-paying jobs, some good jobs here, particularly in the natural resources sector. So I know the member said very enthusiastically that he supported free trade deals, but I would say to him that we know that there are regions in Quebec that were adversely affected as well. So we need to do the job, do it right to make sure that key industries in Canada are protected so that we don't lose good jobs and industries in Quebec and Canada. The honourable member for Berthier-Mascouche. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for her question. Yes, indeed, I agree. We have to work diligently and intelligently. That's what I said before, and that's why I said in my speech, I talked about Bill C-282, which is currently before the Senate. The purpose of that legislation is to protect a very key, sensitive industry. So we should support deals that are intelligent and that don't sacrifice one group for the benefit of another. So I think we need to work together on this. Thank you. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Mirabel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent speech, of course. And he talked generally about the relationship between multinationals and national governments that operate on a level playing field, basically. So when we put multinationals on the same footing as national governments, it's a bit like saying to the Ukraine and other international partners that we're going to export the dirtiest oil in the world to you, and those countries may have regulations that protect the environment, and then they end up being perceived as anti-free trade. So why can't we put something in these free trade deals that requires respect for the environment? The honourable member for Berthier-Mascouche. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my eminent colleague from Mirabel for that intelligent question. Absolutely, and that's why I said so in my speech. There's an urgent need for action in that area. And in Canada and in Quebec and also in the world, governments have a tendency to delegate their responsibilities to multinationals. And I'm thinking, for example, of genome regulations. I talked about that recently in the House. When we see that it's the private companies that are providing the studies, that are drafting the regulations, there's a danger there. And I think national governments have to take responsibility and limit the power of a private company. The people is represented by a government, and it's important to remember that. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a tough act to follow when you speak after the member for Berthier-Maskinongé. He's so brilliant and knowledgeable in this area. But to begin with, I'll just set the historical context for this deal. So C-57 would it doesn't really change the deal, but it implements it. This deal was negotiated under the Harper government and signed in 2017 by the current government. And now in 2023, we're improving the 2017 deal, the deal between Canada and Ukraine. So I'm going to talk about the improvements to the deal. Basically, the 2023 deal codifies a treaty. It specifies that the territory of Ukraine includes the Donbass and Crimea, which are two regions that were invaded and occupied by Russia and have been for some 10 years. The 2023 deal is more complete than the 2017 deal, and it was signed by President Zelensky on September 22nd when he was visiting Canada. C-57, in other words, the Implementation Act, is only 15 pages long. It's not the deal itself, it's the implementation of the bill. And it basically contains concordance, provisions, covering the changes that were made to the deal. So the bill authorizes the creation and recognizes the authority and provides for the funding of various organizations under the agreement. For example, the bill creates a secretariat tasked with the smooth operation of the deal. Now, of course, you can't be against apple pie. In Quebec, you can't be against poutine. But the deal itself is 1,000 pages long, divided into 30 chapters. So it's pretty complicated. It's more complicated than even the most complicated poutine. So it covers goods and services, investments, public contracting or procurement, some health measures, labor, environment law. There are even provisions favoring small businesses or businesses run by women or Indigenous people. So it's a pretty voluminous, complex deal, which requires study. We need to take the time, not so much on C-57, but on the content of the deal itself, as my colleague from Berthier-Maskinongé said. And not only may we have questions about supply management, we've seen in the past that Quebec's aluminum was not protected in the CUSMA deal between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, whereas the auto sector in Ontario was protected. So is that going to happen again here? We need to take the time we need to study this deal before it gets implemented. The 2023 deal has 11 new chapters as compared to the 2017 deal. We're talking about trans-border trade in services, and there are new rules applicable to that. There's a listing of steps to be taken around foreseeability and consistency in administrative practices. So we talk about the importance of foreseeability or predictability, and that's the new deal contains provisions around that. There's improvement to the 1994 agreement on protecting investments, including a definition of expropriation. The definition of expropriation was tightened up to make sure that there's no inappropriate or unjustified expropriations. But the current deal creates a problem that's fairly significant. It makes it possible for an investor to sue a foreign government. That's a problem because an international trade deal is a deal between nations. But this would put companies on an equal footing with a national government. It's a precedent that should be avoided. We can discuss this further, of course, at committee, but I think we need to talk about how we protect national governments from undue power or influence from multinationals. So is there a solution? We can discuss this at committee, as I said, but I think the most straightforward solution is to bring multinationals back down lower, that they should be subordinate to national governments. When it comes to trade, as I said, the current deal, the new deal rather, rounds out the chapter on trans-border trade and services, and it specifies exceptions that Canada and Ukraine would like to maintain. It also talks about business people, it talks about telecommunications, and it guarantees access to infrastructure without touching on broadcasting and cultural policies. Because, of course, Ukrainian culture is quite different from ours. Now, even within Canada, we have different cultures, so we want to protect those cultures, including Francophone and Indigenous cultures. The New Deal defines the rules applicable to financial services, and now there are going to be rules facilitating the use of financial services and the circulation of capital in each country. There are 3 chapters concerning the participation of small and medium-sized businesses, women, and Indigenous people, and provision is made for preferential, to make it possible to give preferential treatment to those 3. And the bill also codifies regulations around transparency and predictability or foreseeability. 8 chapters have been amended: rules of origin, digital trade, competition policy, monopolies and state-owned businesses, procurement, environment and labor, and transparency, and the fight against corruption, and responsible corporate conduct. So those are the 8 new chapters, the amended chapters. In short, to sum up, Bill C-57 implements a deal. It's more complete than the 2017 deal. However, like any other trade deal, this one's 1,000 pages long, but there's basically nothing. This obviously, the deal will have an impact on people because we're the ones who create the goods and services. And we really haven't had a voice in all of this. All we're being asked to do here is to say yay or nay, let's implement it. So we were really not consulted on the 1,000 pages in the deal. That's the problem. It could have been done. There could have been consultations with workers and companies and obviously with members of parliament. That didn't happen. And the amendments we might have to C-57 are limited because really we're just being asked to say yay or nay to C-57. So we can amend C-57, but we can't amend the deal itself. So our power here is quite limited. And the provinces weren't very involved either in the process. So there may be constitutional issues when it comes to Quebec jurisdiction and provincial jurisdiction, but the provinces and Quebec were not consulted. So basically, Quebec and the Canadian provinces will be subjected to the consequences of this deal without having really had a voice. And finally, we will be voting in favor of this bill because this trade deal, this must be said, this is a good trade deal, not just for Canada, but also for Ukraine, because it will allow Ukraine to rebuild economically and physically. Thank you. Questions and comments?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, just to reflect on the member's concerns in regards to the whole issue of consultations, I'm sure she can appreciate the fact that at the end of the day we have a negotiating team representing Canada, and that negotiating team is individuals with just a great experience in terms of having the understanding and no doubt considerable dialogue with respect to all the different types of issues, including, I would suggest to you, some of the debates that have occurred here from the past in regards to concerns with respect to trade agreements. And a good example of that would be the issue of, let's say, of supply management, knowing full well where political entities and how people feel about supply management. That the general feelings of Canadians is reflected at the beginning of the negotiations and throughout the negotiations to ensure that Canadians are best served. The question I have for the member is, would she not agree at some point we have to allow the Canadian negotiators to actually get the agreement so that the heads of both governments are able to sign off, and we are afforded the opportunity to have further ongoing discussions?
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't doubt the abilities of the negotiators speaking for Canada. However, there are blind spots sometimes. I talked about aluminum with CUSMA. We had to fight here in the House and the response was, oh, it's just as protected as the auto industry, but no, it wasn't. So changes had to be made. We could talk about supply management too, which affects our farmers' revenues or income, and there have been concessions made there. So yes, the negotiators are competent, but there are blind spots, and that's what I'm talking about. And there's also the issue of Quebec and provincial jurisdiction, because the negotiators are speaking for with a federal perspective, not necessarily otherwise. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her excellent speech. Clearly, this deal was negotiated by the federal government. It's a good deal. It was negotiated by the federal government without consultation with the provinces, and this has entered into force in a temporary way without having been voted on yet. Obviously, we're sovereignist, and there are many sovereignists in Quebec. And basically, if we were to become a sovereign country, we'd have to renegotiate everything. So deals are negotiable. They can be renegotiated. They can be changed. So my question for my colleague is, if Quebec were independent, could we have negotiated this kind of a deal? And would Ukraine have been interested in entering into such a deal with Quebec? The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's an interesting question. An independent Quebec would negotiate for itself, and some people say, oh, Quebec would be way too small to negotiate for itself. You're not big enough. You're too small. You're a small fry. But an independent Quebec geographically is bigger than Ukraine. Demographically, we're almost the same population size. So if Ukraine can negotiate for itself like a big boy, well, we are too in Quebec. Thank you.
Churchill Kiwatanokaski.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. She gave examples of industries and workers that would be have been left out in the negotiation of trade deals. So I'd like to ask her once again to explain how important it is to take our time and make sure we're protecting economically important sectors here at home and that are important to our communities too. The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. When you negotiate a trade deal, the goal should ultimately be not just to get a good deal for our country, but also for it to be mutually beneficial for both countries. But we can't protect ourselves without protecting our own economy. And if we let another country, any other country, have an advantage under a trade deal, a free trade deal should be equitable, fair, and it should protect jobs. It should protect the economies of both countries so that the trade becomes complementary. Thank you.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to speak on behalf of the wonderful residents of my riding of Davenport. And today I'll be speaking on Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine. But before I begin my formal written remarks, I want to take a few minutes to just make a few comments, Mr. Speaker. First, what I want to say is, I want to say how happy I am that this bill has been introduced into the House. I also want to say how grateful I am to the Minister of International Trade for her leadership and work. You know, at a time of war, it's really important for us to be thinking about the Ukrainian economy both today and tomorrow, so I want to say a huge thanks to her. I also want to say I'm very grateful to my colleagues on the Ukrainian-Canadian Friendship Group for their focus and attention on this, particularly my colleague from Etobicoke Centre. And then I also want to say I'm very grateful to a number of key stakeholders who have helped to shape this agreement, including the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, the Canada-Ukraine Chamber of Commerce, the Ukrainian-Canadian Professional and Business Association of Toronto, the Ukrainian-Canadian Social Service of Canada, the Ukrainian-Canadian Bar Association. So I want to thank all of them. I also want to acknowledge the context of which we are living in today, one in which we're introducing this modernized trade agreement. You know, as we all know, because this is something that is troubling us every single day, is that we have major wars in the world underway today. You know, in February of 2022, Russia started the unprovoked and illegal, brutal war in Ukraine, and this continues today. More recently, on October 7th, we had Hamas initiate a brutal and violent war against Israel, and that unfortunately also continues today. And both are clear illustrations of an attack on our democracies using war and terrorism. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I do put out statements to my constituents constantly to give them an update on what's happening. And in my latest update, on Friday, I said the following. I said, we're in a struggle to defend our values, our humanity, and to stand up against these attacks on democracy. There's no simple solution to the conflict, but the work to find a humanitarian path to end the violence should be driven by one basic principle, and that is the most basic value of all, to protect and cherish human life. And you'll say to me, why are you mentioning this during a speech on the modernization of the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement? And I'll say to you, it's because at a time of war where we're fighting for our values, for our democracy, for the right to continue to choose the way we live, real everyday life continues, you know, and it's important to not only support the current economy in Ukraine, but also the one that they're trying to build for when the war they are fighting eventually ends. And I'm really glad that Canada is there, Mr. Speaker. And maybe just one other aside that I want to make is, you know, it's my privilege to be able to currently serve as the chair of the Canada-NATO Parliamentary Association. And at our international meetings where we have NATO parliamentarians assemble, I will tell you that we do talk about rebuilding Ukraine after the war. And we know that the work begins now. And so I'm very proud that Canada is stepping up and very much that we are playing our part. So now for my formal, more written remarks, Mr. Speaker. It is a true honor for me to rise in the House today in support of legislation to implement the modernized Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as CUFTA. As we all know, Canada and Ukraine have enjoyed very close bilateral relations since 1991, when Canada became the first Western country to recognize Ukrainian independence, an issue that we are sadly still fighting for to this day. These bilateral relations are strengthened by shared values and warm people-to-people ties rooted in the Ukrainian-Canadian community of nearly 1.3 million people. And Mr. Speaker, my family is very much part of this community. Recently, the Canada-Ukraine bilateral relationship has been marked by Canada's steadfast support to Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in the face of protracted Russian aggression. Whether it was in 2014 when Russia illegally occupied Crimea, or today following Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Canada has stood steadfast beside our Ukrainian allies to support them as they fight for their independence, democracy, and freedom. As such, since the beginning of the conflict in February 2022, Canada has committed almost $9 billion in multifaceted support to Ukraine, which includes $5 billion in financial assistance, including $4 billion in loans through the International Monetary Fund's administered account for Ukraine, as well as $500 million through Canada-Ukraine Sovereignty Bond. Over $2 billion in military assistance and defense, of which I know that our Minister of Defense has recently made an additional announcement. $352 million in humanitarian assistance, and a lot of that actually goes to the Ukrainian Women's Fund, Mr. Speaker, which is for much necessary work in the country. $147 million in development assistance, $102 million in security and stabilization assistance, and $4.8 million in cultural protection. Additionally, Canada has established new immigration measures for Ukrainians fleeing Russia's invasion, for which we have committed $1.2 billion. Mr. Speaker, honourable members, today we have yet another opportunity to demonstrate our continued support to Ukraine through other means that will not only offer assistance in the short term, but will extend well beyond the current unfortunate situation and will form the basis on which Canada can support the reconstruction of Ukraine for years to come. I am, of course, referring to the modernized CUFTA, the reason why I'm addressing you here today. The original CUFTA entered into force in August 2017 and immediately eliminated tariffs on 99% of imports from Ukraine. Similarly, the 2017 CUFTA immediately eliminated tariffs on 86% of Canadian exports to Ukraine, and the balance of tariff concessions to be implemented over a 7-year period, or by January 1, 2024. While reductions in coal supplies from Canada caused a slight drop in total trade following the 2017 CUFTA's entry into force, non-coal exports grew at a rapid pace, and in 2021, total bilateral trade reached its highest point ever at $447 million, before dipping to $421 million in 2022 due to Russia's invasion. In 2022, top Canadian exports to Ukraine included armored vehicles, fish, medicine, motor vehicles imports, and pet food. Top imports from Ukraine included fats and oils, iron and steel, electrical machinery, and processed foods. Canadian investment in Ukraine in 2022 amounted to $112 million. While comprehensive from a trade in goods perspective, the 2017 CUFTA did not include chapters on trade in services or investment. These areas were left out of the agreement due to divergent approaches at the time. Rather, the CUFTA contained a clause committing Canada and Ukraine to review the agreement within 2 years of its entry into force, with a view to expanding it. The review clause specifically identified services and investment as potential additions, but did not restrict the parties from exploring other areas. Pursuing to this review clause, in a visit to Ottawa in July 2019, the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, and the Ukrainian President, President Zelensky, announced their intention to modernize the CUFTA. Our federal government then held formal public consultations on the modernization of the CUFTA in the winter of 2020. Submission supported the initiative as a means of strengthening the bilateral relationship, building on Canada's commercial engagement with Ukraine, and further promoting an open, inclusive, and rules-based trading environment for our businesses and investors. The Government of Canada also received positive feedback from the provinces and territories, several of which were particularly supportive of the potential inclusion of new or modernized chapters on cross-border trade and services, financial services, investment, digital trade, and additional commitments to support small and medium-sized enterprises. All of these areas have been successfully included in the modernized CUFTA, as well as new chapters or provisions on trade and gender, trade and Indigenous peoples, digital trade, transparency, labor and environment, among many other areas. Following these internal consultations and delays due to COVID-19 pandemic, we know that there was an announcement to launch the negotiations for a modernized CUFTA in January 2022. Unfortunately, only weeks later, on February 24th, 2022, Russia began its full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. This caused another delay in progress, with Canadian trade officials relaying to their Ukrainian counterparts that they stood ready to proceed with CUFTA modernization discussions in accordance with Ukraine's capacity and willingness to do so. So negotiations, Mr. Speaker, restarted in June 2022, and despite compressed timelines and difficult circumstances for our negotiating partner, they were highly constructive. Both sides demonstrated an eagerness to reach an ambitious and high-standard agreement on par with Canada's most comprehensive trade agreements, with the aim of facilitating increased trade between our two nations long into the future. During a visit by the Ukrainian Prime Minister on April 11, 2023, he and our Prime Minister announced the conclusion of negotiations for the modernized CUFTA, and each committed to undertaking their respective domestic processes to facilitate its signature and entry into force as soon as possible. During his most recent visit to Ottawa on September 22, 2023, President Zelensky and our Prime Minister signed the final modernized CUFTA text. This was a historic milestone in the Canadian-Ukrainian bilateral relationship and served as another clear demonstration of Canada's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. With the final agreement officially signed, both sides are now undertaking the next steps to enter the agreement into force as early as January 1st, 2024. That, Mr. Speaker, is why we are here today. Now, if I may, I will say a few words about the modernized agreement and some of the benefits and opportunities it presents for Canadians and Ukrainians alike. Substantive negotiations have resulted in a modernized CUFTA that will include 9 dedicated new chapters and upgrades to 9 existing chapters from the 2017 CUFTA. I'll begin with an overview of the new chapters that have been added. First, the agreement includes a dedicated new chapter on cross-border trade and services, which puts both Ukrainian and Canadian service suppliers on a comparable footing vis-à-vis our main services trading partners. Additionally, this chapter includes provisions on the recognition of professional qualifications that will facilitate trade in professional services, which is strategically important for both parties in a knowledge-based and digital economy. Parties have also added a new chapter on investment that will replace the Canada-Ukraine FIPA. It features modern drafting to ensure investment obligations operate as intended and provide necessary flexibility in key policy areas. The new chapter includes a modern dispute settlement mechanism that will help Canadian investors participate with more confidence during Ukraine's reconstruction and beyond. The modernized CUFTA includes a financial services chapter with core obligations related to market access, national treatment, and most favored nation treatment, while maintaining flexibility for regulators to preserve the stability of their financial systems. The financial services chapter will support a predictable, stable, and transparent investment environment for investors and allows Ukraine a 10-year period to transition from its existing World Trade Organization commitments to those included in this agreement. There's also a new chapter on telecommunications, which promotes competition and provides enhanced certainty for telecommunications service suppliers when operating in Canadian and Ukrainian markets. The chapter also includes commitments to ensure that regulators of the telecommunications sector are independent, impartial, and transparent. Parties have also added a chapter on temporary entry for business persons, which provides new access for Canadians and Canadian companies to do business, invest, and work in highly skilled occupations on a temporary basis in Ukraine, while providing Canadian employers with easier access to highly skilled Ukrainian workers. New chapters on inclusive trade, namely trade and gender, trade in small and medium-sized enterprises, and trade in Indigenous peoples seek to empower and create opportunities for these underrepresented groups to increase their participation in and expand their benefits from the modernized CUFTA. Notably, the Trade and Indigenous Peoples chapter is the first of its kind that either party has ever included in a free trade agreement. Lastly, there's a chapter on good regulatory practices, and it demonstrates to current and future trading partners that Ukraine is able to take on commitments that support a regulatory environment conducive to trade. In addition to these new chapters, Mr. Speaker, that I've outlined, we've also agreed with Ukraine to update 9 chapters from the existing agreement. So this includes rules of origin and origin procedures, where Canada and Ukraine have agreed to activate an article from the 2017 CUFTA on culmination of origin. This will allow materials of any non-party with which both Canada and Ukraine have existing free trade agreements, such as the European Union, to be taken into consideration by the exporter when determining whether a product qualifies as originating under CUFTA. This will make it easier for Canadian and Ukrainian businesses to participate in regional value chains, and it reflects a shared desire to support trade among like-minded partners. The new digital trade chapter aims to improve regulatory certainty for businesses seeking to engage in the digital economy in both markets, as well as those specifically looking to engage in cross-border digital trade between Canada and Ukraine. The modernized CUFTA also includes a standalone competition policy chapter, which enhances both parties' objective for a fair, transparent, predictable, and competitive business environment through enhanced obligations for procedural fairness and identification and protection of confidential information by authorities. The monopolies and state enterprises chapter has been upgraded to include important definitions for state-owned enterprises and designated monopolies, and updated commitments on transparency and technical cooperation. In the modernized government procurement chapter, Mr. Speaker, Canada and Ukraine have agreed to provisions clarifying that parties are not prevented from undertaking policies and programs to support domestic initiatives such as green and social procurement. The modernized CUFTA also includes perhaps the most comprehensive and ambitious environment chapter ever achieved in a Canadian free trade agreement. The updated chapter seeks to promote robust, ambitious, and transparent environmental governance, and for the first time includes a dedicated chapter or dedicated article reaffirming the parties' commitment to addressing climate change. There's also an updated labor chapter, which shows that Canada and Ukraine are committed to the highest labor rights standards. Fully subject to dispute settlement mechanism of the agreement, the chapter commits Canada and Ukraine to implement in their labor laws the content of the core International Labor Organization conventions. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, the Transparency, Anti-Corruption, and Reasonable Business Conduct chapter promotes transparency and integrity among public officials, private sector, and society, advances enforceability of anti-corruption laws, and includes a new section to encourage responsible business conduct. Mr. Speaker, these negotiated outcomes will not only position Canadian firms to better participate in the economic reconstruction of Ukraine, but will also support Ukraine's trade policy interests globally. And our Ukrainian colleagues have already expressed to us the value of the modernized CUFTA as the model of a modern, comprehensive, and high-standard agreement with prospective trading partners around the globe. Domestically, the modernized agreement will reinforce the regulatory framework of a more inclusive, predictable, and transparent trading and investment environment, which will benefit Canadian workers, businesses, and entrepreneurs. While the war continues to hinder trade both globally and bilaterally between Canada and Ukraine, the benefits and opportunities our countries have secured through this FTA are varied and long-term and will support growth in our commercial relationship now and for years to come. During President Zelensky's recent visit, he and Prime Minister Trudeau had the opportunity to participate in a business roundtable in Toronto. At this event, we heard from business leaders from across Canada about the scope of commercial trade and investment interests in Ukraine, the risks associated with doing business in Ukraine, and how to overcome these risks to ensure the private sector in Canada is well positioned to invest and support Ukrainian reconstruction. Indeed, Canadian reconstruction companies such as AECON are already moving forward to form partnerships with Ukrainian companies and to aid reconstruction. And so, Mr. Speaker, this agreement, I'm just going to end just because I know that I only have 1 minute left. So, Mr. Speaker, honourable members, this agreement is not just about economic gains. It also represents a landmark in the Canada-Ukraine relationship and serves as another clear demonstration of Canada's unwavering support to Ukrainian sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. We stand with Ukraine, and this agreement is another bond between us. And so, to that end, I urge all honourable members to support the legislative amendments contained in Bill C-57 and to support this legislation. Thanks so much, Mr. Speaker.
Just a quick reminder, folks, when we're referring to members of the House of Commons to use their titles or to use their writing names. Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for the speech. And one thing that we've seen in previous trade deals, and I think about the free trade agreement with China that the Harper government signed back in 2014. And that agreement, Mr. Speaker, they locked into, well, I'm being heckled by Conservatives, I'll just remind them, that they signed a trade agreement with China for 31 years, Mr. Speaker. That trade agreement, Mr. Speaker, if the member wants to get up on a point of order, he can clarify. But Mr. Speaker, while he's heckling me, I'll remind him that they signed a trade agreement with secret tribunals. Secret tribunals that even Canadians don't know about what's in those secret tribunals when there's an appeal from the Chinese government that wants to override, say, Canadian rights. Now, there was a woman in my riding, Brenda Sayers, a lawyer, an esteemed lawyer from the Hupechuset Nation, who took the Harper government to court and appealed that this was violating Indigenous rights. Now, one thing I like that's in this agreement is there's a chapter on trade and Indigenous peoples, and it reaffirms the party's commitment to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My question through you to my colleague is, does she agree that Indigenous-focused chapters should be included in all free trade agreements moving forward so that we don't end up in the same position we are in because of the Conservatives in their trade agreement with China and other trade agreements they signed?
The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his excellent question. And from my side of the House, I'm hearing some of my colleagues say, good question, which is really great. Look, as I mentioned in my speech, the chapter that includes trade and Indigenous people, which seeks to empower and create opportunities for this underrepresented group, I think it's the first of its kind that either Ukraine or Canada has ever included in a free trade agreement. And I think that the reason we included that is because we think it's important, and I do think it's something we should be considering for all other future trade agreements moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In comments, the honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just following up on the previous question from my NDP colleague who suggested time and time again that Canada has a free trade agreement with China. Well, that's patently false, and I think he knows that. What he's actually referring to is a Foreign Investment Protection and Promotion Agreement, FIPA as they're called. I would ask this member who just gave a speech, a very good speech on Ukraine, is it her understanding that Canada has gone so far as to sign a trade agreement with China? And why is Ukraine actually the priority right now when it comes to negotiating free trade?
The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his question. I think I'm just going to keep my comments to the current trade agreement. Look, we have stood with Ukraine for forever. They are one of the largest diaspora. Ukrainians are one of the largest diasporas here in Canada. We stand with them as they are fighting this brutal and illegal war against Russia and in their fight for democracy, because it is a fight that they are fighting also on our behalf. For us, this is our way of helping to support their current economy and to help create a foundation for their economy from which to build once the war is currently over. We stand with Ukraine today. We stood with them yesterday, and we will stand with them for as long as it takes through this war, and we will be there as they are growing their economy after this war moving forward. Thanks so much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Pierre Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my colleague on her speech and my colleagues on their questions. As you know, today we're debating Bill C-57, Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. This is not a bill that creates a lot of division or disagreement in the House. But this gives us an opportunity to talk about Ukraine on the one hand, and on the other hand, to talk about the importance of free trade agreements and the process of free trade agreements. Now, of course, we hope that Ukraine will recover as soon as possible. Having a free trade agreement with Ukraine to facilitate our trade can only be helpful in that sense in helping Ukraine recover. But I'm wondering about negotiation of free trade agreements. It's done by the government, by the executive branch. The government takes full control of that, and Parliament has no say in the matter other than voting in favor or against it when it comes to voting. So would my colleague agree that we have no say in the bill? We do, of course, want a free trade agreement with Ukraine, but it would be better if we really had a say in this, because we're elected to represent our constituents, but the government is in some ways preventing us from doing so. The Honourable Member for Davenport.
And I want to thank the Honourable Member for his question. I don't agree with him. I do think that there's a number of opportunities for members to be able to provide their input. Once we pass, if it manages to get a vote through this House, it will move into committee, and I think that there is enormous opportunity for comments from members from all sides of the House at that point in time. I'll also say that none of these negotiations are ever conducted in secret. I think there's many opportunities, whether it's through the various different stakeholder groups that I had mentioned at the onset of my speech, for there to be input. But I also think that the minister is always open for feedback from anyone in this House. For us, it's important to have the best agreement possible, and we'll take the best ideas. It doesn't matter where they come from. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really pleased I'm able to get in on this round because it's been a very interesting discussion between the member from Courtenay Alberni, the member for Abbotsford, and the Honourable Member for Danforth about investor protection agreements. They are not trade agreements. So both the member for Courtenay Alberni is correct that the previous government under Stephen Harper executed a secret agreement, never came before Parliament for a vote. It was done as an order in council, committing Canada not to a trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, but to an investor protection agreement, as the member from Abbotsford referred to it, a FIPA, which binds Canada for more than 31 years and in which challenges against Canadian law by corporations out of the People's Republic of China do not require any public notice to Canadians, can proceed in secret. I just want to ask the Honourable Member for Danforth, the current Canada-Ukraine agreement includes an investor protection agreement. When Canada renegotiated the NAFTA with the U.S., it removed Chapter 11, the investor protection agreement. Has any thought, and was any thought given in renegotiating the agreement with Ukraine in removing this quite anti-democratic provision, which is almost ubiquitous across the globe in trade agreements these days, to include an investor protection agreement? Was any thought given to removing it from the Canada-Ukraine agreement?
I'll just take my time too here. The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to correct the record that I am the Member of Parliament for Davenport. Very, very proud. I don't ever mind being confused with my wonderful colleague, the Member of Parliament for Danforth. We are often confused, and so, but I did want to correct the record on that. I will say to you that Canada and Ukraine, I believe, already had a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement. And so the new investment chapter in the modernized agreement features modern drafting, ensuring that the parties remain flexible from a policy perspective, and their right to regulate in key areas. It also includes a new chapter with a modern dispute settlement mechanism, which will, among other important updates, strengthen alternatives to avoid arbitration as well as enhance transparency of proceedings commitments. So thanks so much for the opportunity, and thank you for all the excellent questions, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, and we got about a whole minute left. I don't know who caught my eye there that first time. I think the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just if I can get the members' comments in regards to just how trade agreements are economically to the advantage of both Canada and Ukraine, and obviously, the war is something in which is on all of our minds, and the impact that having a trade agreement for whether it's morale or just making a very strong political statement at the same time.
The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for the excellent question. The opportunity just to say to this House that the introduction of this legislation is an important milestone in the implementation of a modernized Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. It's a first trade agreement that Ukraine has signed since the onset of Russia's illegal war. I know that they want to use this as a model for signing other trade agreements as they're trying to support their economy in this while undergoing an illegal, brutal war. And they want to be able to set themselves up for a good economy once this war is over. And so I will say to you, Canada will be with Ukraine and support Ukraine for whatever it takes for as long as it takes. Thanks so much, Mr. Speaker.
Debate, reprise de débat, the Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to let you know that I will be sharing my time with the Honourable Member from Mission Maskey Fraser Canyon that just showed. Yes. I think it's number 2, but whatever. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak on Bill C-57, a piece of legislation that would formalize the modernized Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. This agreement offers the chance for us to look back on the opportunities that Canada had on the world stage and some of the context as to where we are now with the Ukraine trade, and more generally, European trade as a whole. Mr. Speaker, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe found itself in a tough spot. Almost overnight, countries had to look for new sources of energy, oil and gas. They needed to act fast. Canada was in prime position to fill that void, to be the reliable country that Europe needed in that critical moment. But what happened? We dropped the ball, Mr. Speaker. We didn't seize the opportunity. Germany, for example, one of the most advanced nations on this earth, had to scramble to keep houses warm in the winter, when Russian natural gas was no longer an option. In an era where we talk day and night about green energy and reducing emissions, Germany had no choice but to look towards other sources of energy to power their country. And why weren't we prepared, Mr. Speaker? We had tied our own hands with endless red tape, long wait times, and bureaucratic hurdles. Our energy industry, once a global leader, has been reduced to a shadow of its former self, unable to act when the world needed it the most. So we didn't just fail Ukraine or Europe, Mr. Speaker, we failed ourselves. We missed a golden opportunity to make a real meaningful impact on the world stage, to help Ukraine in a tangible way, and to quickly divert European reliance on Russia. This isn't just about missed business opportunities, it's about missing the chance to do good when it was needed the most. Mr. Speaker, there's a narrative we need to correct. The idea that all oil and gas is created equal, that they have all the same environmental footprint, is simply not true. Canadian liquid natural gas, known as LNG, is among the cleanest in the world. If Europe were to replace their current oil and gas imports with Canadian products, there is a good chance that we would be replacing imports from countries that have lower environmental standards. Our oil and gas sector has invested heavily in technology to minimize environmental impact. It's not just about economics. It's also about responsible energy production. Using Canadian LNG would offer European countries a cleaner alternative to what they are strongly sourcing. This is an important aspect when looking at trade with other countries. We need to make sure we are creating access to our reliable and clean energy for Ukraine and other European nations. It's a win-win situation, one that benefits both our economy and the global environment. So when we talk about missing opportunities, we're not just talking about financial gains. We're talking about missing an opportunity to make a real, meaningful impact on global carbon emissions, something that this NDP Liberal government should care deeply about. Instead, Canada missed out on this opportunity. We couldn't help Ukraine with energy reliance, and we couldn't help the rest of Europe either. There's another layer to this as well, an ethical one. If we don't step up, Europe has no choice but to buy oil and gas from dictatorships that don't share our values, places where human rights and environmental concerns take a back seat. We have a moral duty to offer a better alternative, and Canadian LNG is that alternative. Mr. Speaker, ethics matter. Where we get our energy from isn't just a question of economics or even of environmental protection. It's a question of values. When Europe buys energy from autocratic regimes, what message does that send? What sort of behavior does it endorse? These regimes don't think twice about suppressing their own people or destabilizing their regions. We saw this immediately after the onset of the war in Ukraine. However, this is not an isolated situation. There are several exporting countries that fall under this umbrella of unethical and autocratic governance. Canada stands as a beacon of democracy and human rights on the world stage. When you buy Canadian, you're not just buying a product. You're buying into a set of values. Values that respect human dignity, that prioritize environmental sustainability, and that advocate for peace. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, if Europe could shift its dependency from other oppressive regimes to a country that shares its core principles. It not only sends a powerful message to the world, but would have a direct, positive impact on our allies, such as Ukraine. By strengthening our energy infrastructure and expanding our LNG capabilities, we can offer that alternative. An alternative that aligns with the values we hold both dear in Canada and democratic societies around the world. Mr. Speaker, last year, the leader of the official opposition hit the nail on the head when he spoke about Canada's missed opportunities in the energy sector. While Europe, including Ukraine, was scrambling for alternatives to Russian gas, we sat on the sidelines. Why? Because we lacked the necessary infrastructure and political will. Our inability to provide Europe with a viable alternative made them turn back to less than ideal options. The leader of the official opposition was absolutely right. We had a shot at not just benefiting our economy, but also at elevating our role on the global stage. We could have been the solution that Europe, including Ukraine, was desperately searching for. And what stopped us? Red tape and a lack of foresight from this Liberal government. This isn't just about energy. It's about seizing strategic opportunities when they present themselves. Mr. Speaker, as we discuss Bill C-57, I urge all of us to reflect on the broader implications of our international trade policies. We are always looking at the possibilities of strengthening our free trade around the world. However, we must also address missed opportunities that have significant global impacts. This bill will likely bring up the topic of energy as it develops, a sector where Canada has failed to take the lead at crucial moments. our leader of the official opposition, was clear last year about the shortcomings of the Liberal government. We need to move beyond endless paperwork and bureaucracy that stalls progress. I can't help but stress that Canada had a chance to supply Ukraine and Europe as a whole with our natural gas, a cleaner, ethical option compared to what they're getting now. Instead, European countries, including Germany and Ukraine, were forced back to less desirable options because we didn't have the infrastructure to support their need. As we consider Bill C-57, let's not just look at words on the paper. Let's think about what those words mean in context of Canada's role on the world stage. Are we simply going to be participants, or will we be leaders? As we look to possibly expand our trade with Ukraine, let's also make sure we're positioned to make the most of the similar opportunities in the future. It's not just about economics. It's about taking a stand for cleaner, ethical trade that benefits us today and sets us on the right path for future generations. Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I look forward to questions.
In comments, Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. The member, towards the end of his comment, says, we could be leaders here. And the member is right. What we're seeing is legislation that would clearly demonstrate Canada's leadership in the world. This will be the first trade agreement for Ukraine at a time in which they're going through a war, as we all know. And we all want to give that support to Ukraine in whatever way we can. The general consensus in the House seems to be in favor of the legislation. And that legislation, if passed, is not economically in the best interest of both Canada and Ukraine, but also in regards to sending many other positive messages. We are the first country to have this agreement with Ukraine during the war. I'm wondering if he would join the leadership that's being demonstrated here and get behind the bill and hopefully agree that we need to see this legislation passed before Christmas. Would he not agree?
Go ahead.
Well, I'd like to thank the member for his long statement. I'm not really certain what kind of question there was in there, but I know he's saying he wants it passed before Christmas. Well, I think with any trade agreement, we need to make sure that everything is proper for both countries. You don't want to see either one country taking advantage of another, such as Ukraine right now going through a war situation. So that is the whole purpose of this free trade, is to make sure that it aligns not only with Canadian values, but as well as Ukrainian values, and make sure that both countries aren't also economically viable for each country, but also there's moral and values that should be placed forward in this free trade agreement as well.
The honourable member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague talked about having the political will and the infrastructure to export natural gas products. But it would take 10 years to put that infrastructure in place, and that would also require a pipeline that would go under 800 waterways, including waterways that provide drinking water to most Quebecers. Of course, pipelines are safe, but there's no guarantee there won't be any accident. What would be done if there was an accident?
Thank you, Madam Speaker, through to the member. I think everyone tries to fearmonger a lot, and they talk about the issues that they're having. What I'm talking about is replacing liquid natural gas with either coal or other types of energy that are very reliable. I love how people talk about that we're going to go to wind and solar, and every time we seem to save 1 ton of carbon in Canada, we go to solar energy, which is produced mainly in China, which they use coal electricity there, and yet they produce 2 or 3 tons more than what we take out, and we're saying how green this is. If we're talking about climate crisis around the world, how are we not limiting the amount of emissions that are coming out of China? Why is our first choice always to go to China in order to get things built? That is why I propose we go with natural gas in countries such as Europe to offset all the carbon emissions that China is producing in this world.
Questions and comments? A brief question. The Honourable Courtney Alberni.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, he talked about, doing business with China. But again, I'll go back to the FIPA agreement that the Conservatives signed under Stephen Harper. And before they signed that agreement, Madam Speaker, they forget to tell people, it's like people have amnesia around here, but that they brought 30 executives, CEOs, including oil and gas executives, to China. But guess who paid for it, Madam Speaker? Canadian taxpayers. So my question through you is, does my colleague agree that Trade Mission should still, and the Government of Canada should fund CEOs going over to another country before we have a trade agreement? And if he does think that, does he think that Labour should be invited to jump on the plane that's being funded by Canadian taxpayers?
The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and through to you, to the Honourable Member. I think he's misunderstanding that we're actually talking about free trade agreement with Ukraine. So I'm really not certain why he keeps bringing up China in his trade agreements, and he's talking about how it was a free trade agreement that Harper signed, which was never a free trade agreement. He's well aware of that, but yet he continually keeps pushing that aspect for it. Yet after 10 years of being in operation, there hasn't been any trade issues related to that. So therefore, I think he really needs to focus on Ukraine as opposed to China.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The relationship between Canada and Ukraine is special. Our country is home to more than 1.3 million Canadians of Ukrainian descent. The size of the Ukrainian diaspora is matched by few others in Canada, and it only continues to grow. As was mentioned by my colleague, the member from Abbotsford, our city is now home to a Ukrainian village. In the spring of 2022, I had the opportunity to hire a Ukrainian student studying here in Canada as an intern, and the city of Mission is home to a vibrant Ukrainian Orthodox community. We have people-to-people ties that run deep and are only growing. In fact, before I begin my speech, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the multitude of service organizations, such as MCC, which have been at the forefront of welcoming Ukrainian refugees into Canadian society and integrating them into our community and civic organizations. When I think about the Canadian spirit, that's what it's all about. So thank you to all the organizations that continue to do this very important work today. As Ukraine has established itself as a modern democratic nation, Conservatives have been steadfast in our support of expanding economic ties and standing with Ukraine as they distance themselves from Putin's Russia. That is why Conservatives were committed to getting a free trade deal with Ukraine done when we were in government. Since Russian troops invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, Conservatives have remained steadfast in our support of the Ukrainian people as they fight against authoritarianism and to protect their sovereignty as a modern democratic nation. Ukraine will win this war, and Canada must ensure that we are prepared to assist the Ukrainian people as they rebuild, and we must ensure that it is the aim of any trade agreement with Ukraine going forward. On December 2nd, 1991, the day after Ukraine officially declared its independence from the USSR, Canada joined Poland as the first two nations to officially recognize a sovereign, independent Ukraine. As was mentioned yesterday by my colleague from Prince Albert, it was Canadian farmers who exported technology to Ukraine, allowing Ukraine to modernize its farming practices and turn itself into a powerhouse of agriculture that feeds many other nations. Canada can and should step up to the plate again, and we can do it by giving Ukraine a hand up through trade. And that begs the question, does this agreement allow us to do that? Can this agreement help us provide a hand up to the Ukrainian people? Does it have the necessary tools to provide for a prosperous Ukraine after the war? These questions must be answered as we debate this bill and as it moves through the legislative process. Let's just briefly touch upon the history of the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement. The original agreement entered into force on August 1st, 2017, and eliminated tariffs on 86% of Canada's merchandise exports to Ukraine. It was initially an asymmetrical agreement that was designed to provide more benefit to Ukraine than Canada. Following the ratification of the original CUFTA, non-coal exports to Ukraine grew 28.5% between 2016 and 2019. In July 2019, the governments of Canada and Ukraine agreed to modernize the CUFTA. Canada-Ukraine bilateral trade reached its highest level ever in 2021. Canada's merchandise exports to Ukraine totaled $219 million, and merchandise imports from Ukraine amounted to $228 million. Canada and Ukraine announced the launch of modernization negotiations in January of 2022. However, the Russian invasion in February 2022 has obviously had a very negative effect on our overall bilateral trade and investment, leading to a 31% fall in Canada's exports to Ukraine. In 2022, Canada's top 3 exports to Ukraine were motor vehicles and parts, fish and seafood, and pharmaceutical products. Canada's top imports from Ukraine were animal and vegetable fats and oils, iron and steel, and electrical machinery and equipment. And total merchandise with Ukraine was $420 million, $150 million in exports, and $270 million in imports. The CUFTA updates the following chapters: rules of origin, government procurement, competition policy, monopolies and state enterprises, digital trade, labor, environment, transparency, and anti-corruption. For the first time in a Canadian FTA, the environment chapter includes provisions recognizing the importance of mutually supportive trade and environment-related policies. The CUFTA has new chapters in investment, cross-border trade and services, temporary entry for business persons, development and administration of measures, financial services, telecommunications, trade and gender, trade in SMEs, trade in Indigenous peoples, and regulatory practices. For the first time ever, a Canadian FTA will include a chapter on trade and Indigenous peoples. The CUFTA now replaces the 1994 FIPA in the investment chapter as well. When Conservatives took office in 2006, Canada had trade agreements with just 5 other countries: the United States, Mexico, Chile, Costa Rica, and Israel. By the time Prime Minister Harper left office in 2015, Canada had free trade agreements with an astounding 47 additional countries, and I'd like to thank the honourable member from Abbotsford for all his hard work. The Harper government began negotiating with Ukraine all the way back in 2010. Ukraine had a weak economy at that time, and of course they were struggling to deal with Russia. Despite this, as my honourable colleague from Abbotsford mentioned yesterday, Prime Minister Harper was adamant that Canada pursue free trade with Ukraine. Building a strong economic relationship with Ukraine and in giving them a leg up in establishing itself as a modern, democratic nation with a strong economy remains a priority for Canada today, and one that I am proud of. So as we reflect on the broader implications of Canada's trade policy, we have to look to supporting a country like Ukraine. So the Conservatives will continue to stand with Ukraine as they continue the fight against Putin's authoritarian regime. Canada should be looking for ways to use our economic strength and strategic advantages to support the Ukrainian people including by exporting Canadian LNG to break European dependence on natural gas from Russia. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I look forward to any questions today.
The questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The members got to know I'm going to challenge him on saying that Stephen Harper had 40-plus signed off agreements, trade agreements. You know, history will very clearly, the facts will very clearly show that the member is wrong. That, in fact, those agreements were agreements that were signed off on by this government. But the bottom line is it's good. The Conservative Party supports the agreements that we actually were able to bring across the goal line and get signed off on. I see that as a good thing. Now, the trade agreement that we're debating today goes far beyond just the economic benefits for both Canada and Ukraine. At a time in which we're seeing the war taking place, the illegal invasion of Russia into Ukraine, we can send a very powerful message that goes well past just the economic benefits. And I'm wondering if the member can provide his thoughts on the importance of that message. Whether it's to Putin, we are moving forward with a trade agreement with Ukraine, and that's a very positive thing for both sides, for both countries.
Member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. To my colleague from Winnipeg, to his first point, I can remember fondly, as when I was still a political staffer, a historical moment in the House of Commons when the Deputy Prime Minister walked across the aisle and the member from Abbotsford walked across the aisle and they embraced one another. And they embraced one another in love and friendship over Canada's long-standing policy supported by our two major political parties supporting trade. That was a positive moment.
I want to remind members that if they want to have conversations, to go out, and if they have follow-up questions, to wait till it's the appropriate time. Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Beauport-Limoilou.
Oh, I thought you were done because there was a little bit of a stop there. Okay, well, the member had about 9 seconds left before I would show him that it was time for another question.
Madam Speaker, I'm only giving the requisite time to answer that substantive question with a substantive substantive response, excuse me. So another thing, the member from Winnipeg speaks during this debate has spoken often about all of the trade agreements that the Liberal Party of Canada has signed. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the challenges caused by that government's policies on trade when they took the CPTPP and tried to put in all these different clauses at the end.
I do have to allow for other questions. I know that time just goes by really fast. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Beauport.
The honourable member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, sometimes when we're talking about trade deals, given how long it takes to negotiate those deals, a government of one color will negotiate the deal, and then a government of another color, another political stripe, will sign the deal. And sometimes that's for the best, and sometimes it's for the worst. Apart from oil and gas products, Canada has a lot of exportable natural resources. So I'd like to hear the member talk about some of those things that we could export to Ukraine that would be very helpful to that country.
Fraser Canyon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for her question. Canada can improve our capacity with this deal with Ukraine to export agricultural products, and secondly, we can export equipment for agriculture too. And the deal with Ukraine can also help us with that challenge. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Abbotsford, a brief question.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague's comments about the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. He mentioned that MCC is very active in Abbotsford in helping refugees from Ukraine settle in our beautiful community. And I'd invite him to expand a little bit on that, where they've settled and how they're integrating into our community.
Answer from the honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Yeah, right by Berkman Crescent in Abbotsford, there is a townhouse complex. I believe it's called Lakeside Village. And MCC is coordinated with many of the refugees to live at Lakeside Village. So, you know, on Sunday afternoons when I'm taking my kids for a walk at Mill Lake Park, which is adjacent to Lakeside Village, I'm hearing all these little children speaking in Ukraine. What a great way to integrate new refugees by putting them close to our preeminent park in Abbotsford. It's allowing these kids to integrate more quickly, and it's building those friendships that are so important to making newcomers feel welcome in our wonderful community. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Les créneaux de 20 minutes sont terminés.
The 20-minute slots are over. We will now begin with the 10-minute slots.
The honourable member Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And as I begin discussion today on Bill C-57, which is the updated Canada-Ukraine trade agreement, we've had some conversation already this morning on the subject of the differences between trade agreements and investor protection agreements. I'd like to approach that topic again in talking about the updated Canada-Ukraine trade agreement, and also put a frame around this. Number of Liberal MPs have said this agreement makes an effort to name climate change and tackle climate change in trade agreements. I wish that were so. We have a long way to go if we're going to actually confront the ways in which the World Trade Organization and its creation have actually undermined the climate agreements and multilateral environmental agreements in general. So with that frame, Madam Speaker, I'll move very quickly through some of the larger issues here, because it is unusual for us to have any opportunity in this place to address the trade and investor protection agreements and how they impact climate, and they do. Let's start, Madam Speaker, by looking at the last effective multilateral environmental agreement the world has ever seen. And that was the most effective. It was negotiated in 1987 in Montreal. It is, of course, the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer. I was honored to participate in those negotiations as senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment in the Mulroney government back in those days. And I have to say, if we look at the success of the Montreal Protocol, it's astonishing. We actually have not only arrested the destruction of the ozone layer through various ozone depleting substances, but we've also expanded that agreement with the Kigali Amendment, so it's also being an effective treaty that has helped reduce greenhouse gases. One of the key reasons that the Montreal Protocol was as successful as it was that the agreement to protect the ozone layer had enforcement mechanisms. It had penalties for countries that chose to ignore their commitments to protect the ozone layer. In fact, those treaty sanctions were so effective, they never had to be used because countries abided by their commitments in the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer. The effective sanctions were trade sanctions. It's very hard to imagine any kind of international treaty that binds nation states and has an effective punishment system that would be other than trade agreements. It's the most logical place in which we can inflict some degree of penalty on non-compliance. So the way the Montreal Protocol worked was to say that if any country ignored its commitments to reduce its use of and to stop the production of chlorofluorocarbons and other ozone-depleting substances, that country would be subject to trade sanctions from any other country that was a party to the Montreal Protocol. Now, since every country on Earth was a party to the Montreal Protocol, that's why it was a very effective mechanism. 10 years later, in 1997, in Kyoto, Japan, when we negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, tragically, Canada changed our position 180 degrees. And instead of being a country that championed making these agreements effective by including trade sanctions, our Minister of Environment headed to Kyoto saying that if trade sanctions were included in the Kyoto Protocol for climate action, Canada would not sign. Now, what happened? In that 10-year window was the creation of the World Trade Organization. The end of the Uruguay round of negotiations resulted in a more established center for the trade work globally. Now, all of this emanated from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And Article 20 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade had, since just after the Second World War when it was negotiated, set aside and protected from trade sanction those actions that were considered to be part of natural resource conservation and so on. So Article 20, and it appears as Roman numerals XX of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, set aside essentially environmental protections without using that language. It certainly didn't reference climate, but we had the window there to protect what we did as nations for legitimate, not trade motivated, not protectionist animus, but for legitimate pursuit of environmental protections. We could not be sanctioned by trade deals. That all changed with the creation of the World Trade Organization. It created a committee called the Committee on Trade and the Environment. And instead of asking the useful question, do we have trade agreements that get in the way of environmental protection, they asked a different question. Do we have environmental agreements that get in the way of trade? And they spotted, well, look, there's this Montreal Protocol. We don't like that. We don't like this Basel Convention, which allows trade sanctions, or the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. So we already had a number of agreements that said we are allowed to take measures to protect the environment, and we are in those agreements saying trade can't get in the way. Well, the trade Hydra raised its many ugly heads and said, no, we don't want you to do that. And there was never any decision, by the way, Madam Speaker. There was no ruling. It was just a matter that in every national capital all around the world, the powerful trade ministers at every cabinet table turned to their less powerful environment ministers and said, you can't use these tools anymore. As a result, not a single climate agreement that Canada has ever signed has had any sanctions at all. The only sanction in the Paris Agreement is essentially the annual global stock taking of what language that's coming up at COP28. The global stock take is essentially a sanction based on global shaming and embarrassment, because there is no sanction there at all. We really need to deal with this. And although the window here with the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement is pretty well a closed window because the negotiations are done, let us take this moment to say this is wrong. We need to, and certainly President Zelensky of Ukraine has been one of the most outspoken champions, that the war that Putin launched illegally against Ukraine must not get in the way of climate action. President Zelensky knows it, champions it. This is a good time to say, let's make sure that all of the climate agreements are protected from trade limitations. This is a good time to dust off some of the decisions that have been wrongly assumed to say that you can't pursue climate agreements without violating trade deals. For instance, the tuna dolphin case, shrimp turtle case, both of those cases at the WTO appellate level left out in very clear language. We're not saying, they said, that you can never protect the environment under the WTO, but you can't do it one-on-one. You can't say the U.S. makes its own rules and then tells Mexico what to do. But they did say, in the context of a multilateral agreement that's negotiated, trade has to back off and respect those commitments. That's the case with the Paris Agreement. Every country on earth is bound by it. It's a perfect opportunity for our government to step up and start saying you can't use trade agreements to limit action to protect climate, as has been done. Sanctions against India for moving to renewable energy and so on. And we recently had another investor protection agreement decision that hampers climate action. Just quickly to go back in the 2 minutes remaining to say that trade deals are different from investor protection agreements, but investor protection agreements, such as in Bill C-57, in the existing Canada-Ukraine trade deal, there is an investor protection agreement. These are very corrosive of democracy. in that they say a foreign corporation has a right to sue a government if it doesn't like something that government does that reduces their expectation of profits. Our government got rid of it in negotiating for the new CUSMA with the US. So what was Chapter 11 of NAFTA is now gone. We should be moving quickly to remove investor protection agreements that undermine our democracy and our environmental protections and our labor protections, and getting rid of investor protection agreements, or at least ensuring that they don't give foreign corporations more rights than domestic corporations, would be very welcome indeed. So Bill C-57 as an improvement and modernization of Bill C-50 of the Canada-Ukraine trade agreements is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't do those things that many Liberal MPs have. I think they absolutely they haven't been misleading the House. They absolutely believe it to be true that the Canada-Ukraine agreement, as reflected in C-57, modernizes and includes more protections of the environment. It doesn't really, because unless we get at the basic conflict that trade agreements and the WTO have set themselves up to be superior to multilateral agreements, multilateral environmental agreements like the Paris Agreement, we're always at risk of trade deals and trade decisions from the bodies like the World Trade Organization undermining and sabotaging global climate efforts.
Yeah. Resuming questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I do believe that within C-57, there is references to our environment. There is references to unions and worker labor standards, if I can put it that way. And when I look at previous agreements, I do believe that we are moving the ball forward. That the member makes reference to the World Trade Organization and so forth. And I think at the end of the day, this particular agreement does achieve a significant amount in the right direction with respect to the environment. My question to the member is can she just provide her thoughts in terms of the Green Party's position with respect to this specific deal? Does she anticipate voting in favor of it?
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, I would just agree with the Parliamentary Secretary. There is language about climate. There is language about labor rights. There's language about Indigenous rights. The difficulty here is that you can put in all the language you like in pretty words, but if the effect of the supremacy of trade deals on the World Trade Organization remains untouched, then anything we put in pretty words is undercut by the effective, hard impact. Like it's like having a set of really sharp scissors that cut through that paper. You don't really make the progress that you think you're making to just say we care about climate. But if there's going to be an investor protection agreement that says, I don't like the decision you just made, government of international agreements that make sure that we start changing technologies and moving towards renewable and so on, the ability of a foreign corporation to sue over that undercuts the pretty words. So that would be the point. And I will say to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, I'm in all honesty.
Allow for other questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciated the member's speech on the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. She spent a lot of time talking about investor protections and suggested that foreign investment protection promotion agreements are corrosive to democracy, corrosive to how we represent Canada's sovereignty at home and abroad. However, I would ask her, there has been an investor protection agreement in place with Ukraine since 1994. 30 years. Can she point out one or two cases that have taken place under those provisions that have resulted in Canada's sovereignty being impaired?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
In the generic category of investor protection agreements that have damaged Canada's sovereignty, I would point more to what used to be called NAFTA, where we had decisions taken by our parliament that were reversed because of complaints by US-based corporations. Canada has lost out over and over again in those agreements. And in the case of the one with FIPA with China, since all of those decisions are secret, we don't know how often it's been used to challenge. I think the honourable member for Abbotsford, I think he knows the answer is I can't think of a time that the Canada-Ukraine agreement has been used in ways that preferenced Ukrainian corporations over the government of Canada. But the reality of investor protection agreements is in the context with a bigger power, the Canadian companies have lost out in U.S. challenges under arbitration, as Canadian governments have lost out when U.S. corporations challenge us. It's a consistent thing through investor protection agreements that the larger economic power, whether it's the investor that's the larger economic power or the nation state, whichever's the larger economic power.
I'm sorry, I do have to allow for one more question. The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And along those same lines, I wonder if the member also wants to talk about not just instances of particular investment protection agreements, but also the cumulative effect of constantly building these types of provisions in, whether they appear as independent agreements or as ISDS provisions and trade agreements, the kind of chilling effect that that has on government decision-making long before anything is brought to a trade tribunal.
Answer from the member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
As ever, the member for Elmwood Transcona is brilliant and absolutely right. There is a chilling effect. So when the government of Canada acts to ban a toxic substance, as it did to ban a gasoline additive called MMT, and then we're found to be very bad, naughty, we get our hands slapped. By the way, because the Chrétien government decided to settle this before it got to a decision on MMT, it has the effect that the people at Environment Canada who thought, well, we better ban this because it's a neurotoxin and it's already affecting the health of Canadians, they get sanctioned. And the money that was paid out to Ethel Corporation in that case came out of the core A-based budget of Environment Canada. There's a real chilling effect every single time that Canada, the sovereign state, takes a measure for the environment or human health and gets told that they were bad to do it because a foreign corporation didn't like it. It's quite...
I'm sorry, there's just so much time, unfortunately, and I know that it's a very passionate issue and very important one. The honourable member, resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to contribute to the debate about changes to the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. And I want to start by stating again our full support for Ukraine in the war against Russia that started with an illegal and unjustified invasion of Ukrainian territory last year in February. Not only in response to some of the atrocities committed by Russian forces in the region, but also as a firm stance in favor of international law and a rules-based order that Ukrainians are on the front, very literally on the front line of today. And I think it's important that we, when we choose our allies, that we choose allies who are committed to those values and to the application of international law, and that we hold our allies to high standards when it comes to their observance of international law in what they do. And so there are many ways that you can support allies, and of course Canada has sent various kinds of aid, whether financial or military, to Ukraine, but also being a helpful trading partner in times of strife is also something that's important. And so, you know, what I would say is that at the high level, while we're very committed as New Democrats to supporting Ukraine, details do matter. And that's why there are established procedures for the House and departmental guidelines for ensuring that parliamentarians have time to do their job of proper scrutiny, because we know that sometimes, under the auspices of good causes, governments have been known to sneak a few things in. And that's why the department's own policy on tabling treaties in the House of Commons requires 21 sitting days between the tabling of the text of the treaty and the tabling of enabling legislation. And given that the text of the treaty was tabled on October 17th, just a few days ago, normally that would mean that we wouldn't be seeing enabling legislation until November 22nd. But instead it has come much quickly. It's about a week since the text of the treaty was tabled, and we find ourselves in the second day of debate. So that's in contravention of the department's own guidelines on tabling treaties in Parliament. That's a document that as New Democrats we take very seriously because we take the work of this place seriously. One of the practical consequences of that, Madam Speaker, is that even though we're on the second day of debate for changes to an international trade treaty, caucuses have not had the opportunity to meet since this was tabled. And so it's a very tight turnaround when you're talking about a large document with some important implications. To ask parliamentarians to be speaking with authority to such a large document, as I say, with a lot of detail on just a few days turnaround, does not manifest in spirit, and in this case not even in letter, the government's words about taking Parliament seriously as part of the trade process. So I think that's an important thing for Canadians to know and to understand, and we often in this place there are debates that touch upon the role of Parliament and the seriousness with which government takes Parliament, and I think this is one of those examples. These are the times, not because it's a big controversial thing, precisely because it's not. And we know that the government had signed this treaty well before it was tabled in the House of Commons. There were opportunities to bring Parliament into the loop and to follow the appropriate policy. And for whatever reason, the government chose to take a pass on that, as they too often have in the past. So for those in government who mean it when they say that they take this place seriously, we would exhort them to talk to their colleagues in Cabinet to make sure that they are following at the very least, the established procedures for conducting these kinds of debates and discussions in the House of Commons. And when they get good at least following through on their own commitments and their own established policies, then we can talk about how to do it better, because there certainly are ways to do it better, ways that involve the legislature much earlier on in the process and build a tighter mandate for enabling legislation when it hits the floor of the House. There's been a lot of talk already about some of the language in this agreement, and I thank the previous speaker for having pointed out that flowery language in preambles and elsewhere, if they're not accompanied by proper enforcement mechanisms that have teeth that would catch the attention either of our own government or the governments into which we're entering treaties, the flowery language doesn't really amount to much. So I'm going to lay out what I think is a small but symbolic test of the government's commitment, not just on its process for trade treaties, but also in the context of this particular one and some of the flowery language. There's talk about an Indigenous chapter and Indigenous rights. I know that the government also had flowery language on that file when it came to the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. But when I moved an amendment to the enabling legislation that would be a non-derogation clause for Indigenous rights, which just said nothing in that legislation, nothing in the agreement would impede upon the already established rights of Indigenous people in Canada, I watched the Liberals vote with Conservatives not to have such a clause. Just a reminder that Indigenous people do have rights in this country, and that nothing that this government does in the context of an international trade treaty can undermine that or take away some of those existing rights. And I was disappointed at the reticence of members in the government to endorse that as a basic principle and to put it in the legislation. Now we see flowery language about Indigenous rights. Let's be sure that at a minimum we're including that non-derogation clause in this enabling legislation. I think that's an important point. I do want to take some time, with the time I have remaining, Madam Speaker, just to talk a little bit about one of the issues that I know certain Conservative colleagues have raised in respect of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and since the war began, more largely about the supply of Canadian oil and gas to Ukraine. What I want to point out, Madam Speaker, regardless of whether you're someone who supports more natural gas and oil development in Canada for export to Ukraine or not, is that when Conservatives talk about this, what they're implying is that we should have a greater role for government in deciding who the customers of Canadian oil and gas companies are. Now, that's not something that I find particularly offensive in principle. I think that is a conversation we should be having. We should talk about what a reasonable level of extraction for oil and gas, barrels per day, barrels per year is. And we should have a conversation about the best way to use those finite resources. Finite because they're not renewable resources. Finite because if we're doing it right, we should have some kind of cap on how much extraction can happen in a year that is devised with our climate commitments in mind. And oil and gas becomes a very precious resource indeed, as Canadians already know, with the prices that they're being forced to pay. The Conservatives would have you believe because of a carbon tax, but in fact, if you look at the record profits that oil and gas companies have been experiencing over the last number of years, price gouging actually is a much bigger concern, or should be a bigger concern, for Canadians, because whatever government is taking in the form of the carbon tax and delivering back to Canadians in the form of a rebate is a hell of a lot less than what oil and gas companies are taking out of their pocket and sending off into international tax havens. That's costing Canadians a heck of a lot more. But it's rich for the Conservatives to get up and pretend that somehow they're in support of talking about how a public regulatory framework could guide export relationships and contracts for the oil and gas industry. That's not something that they support. Yes, they support getting more oil and gas out of the ground faster. Yes, they support those companies selling it wherever they can make the best buck. But for the government to get involved and actually say we should not be buying oil and gas from these countries, we should be exporting oil and gas to those countries, invites a lot more public involvement in the oil and gas industry than I think they have the stomach for. So that's a debate that I welcome. I think that is something that from many perspectives we should be talking about, the best, most efficient and prosperous use of finite oil and gas resources. But I don't believe that that's a conversation they're serious about having. I think in contexts like this, they use it to score cheap political points, and Canadians should pay attention and not take them at their word on this.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to address the member's opening comments. We need to put it in the perspective of that this is an agreement that was actually signed off on just last month between the Prime Minister and the President. And now we have before us the legislation, which was done in a relatively quick fashion. And what we have to put in the perspective of, or the context of, is the fact that we have an illegal invasion by Russia into Ukraine, a time of war when allied countries around the world, and there's this huge sense of Ukrainian solidarity coming to support Ukraine, and Canada being the first country to actually enter into a trade agreement, even at a time of war. It's there not only for the economic benefits of both Canada and Ukraine, but it also sends the right type of messaging to the people of Ukraine and Russia. And his thoughts on that.
Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Well, I mean, it's true that it was signed off just last month when President Zelensky visited Ottawa, but our understanding is that, in fact, the terms and conditions of that agreement were finalized much sooner. And I think it's important for members of the government not to confuse their own communications imperatives and their desire to have nice press conferences and fancy signing ceremonies with the imperatives of a war. I think that does a disservice. It seems to me that actually the agreement was in a position to be signed sooner, and then they could have followed their own policy and had the legislation in Parliament sooner, and we can honor the imperatives of the war without taking seriously the government's own communication strategy.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I enjoyed the member's speech. However, it did concern me that he was somewhat disparaging towards our oil and gas industry. You know, he accused some in this House of scoring cheap political points. But when you do that, you better not be guilty of doing the very same thing. And unfortunately, he is the guilty one here. I would say this, though. Natural gas is one of the solutions to the world's GHG, greenhouse gas emission challenges. We can displace dirty coal elsewhere around the world by exporting much cleaner natural gas to those countries. There's some urgency in doing this for Ukraine. And I would ask this member, does he not believe that Canada should put in place every single strategy that's available to us in order to get our liquefied natural gas to a country like Ukraine that is in such deep straits, that is in such turmoil because of Russia's invasion? Does he not agree that this is an urgent situation where we should be providing?
Allow him time to respond, and another question after that. The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm very happy to repeat myself. I've said that actually is a conversation that I'm open to, but the member just did the very thing that I warn against, which is he talks about Canada could be sending oil and gas to countries that currently are burning coal. Fair enough. This is to talk about the government selecting places in the world where we think we have a strategic best use for our own oil and gas reserves. Fine, let's have that conversation, but I don't think that's a conversation Conservatives really want to have, because they actually want a free market in oil and gas. They're not interested in having that kind of government intervention. And I think it's telling that he found my comments, which were disparaging not of the oil and gas sector in this case, but of the Conservative Party. He conflated my critique of the Conservative Party with a critique of the industry. I think it's telling that they feel those two things are so closely tied at the hip.
Temps pour une brève question. Courtney Alberni.
Thank my colleague, Madam Speaker, for her speech. And I just want to go back to the oil and gas. And we in this